Hello, fellow Crusaders, and welcome. It is October, and it is horror season. And yes, I said horror, not horror, which some people keep thinking I'm saying horror during this.
That's every season.
Exactly. There's no special time of the year for that, but it is the Halloween season, which means it's time to talk about your scary movies, your blood movies, your gore movies. Terrifier 3 here in about 10 days, which Brian is super excited about. But this is going to be a special 5-part series for us. 2 years ago, we did a special where we basically did kind of like a horror movie a day thing based off, subjects and topics and everything like that, which was a fun video. And I've actually had people come up to me and say that they watched our video and, hey, I really liked this movie that you guys pitched on this day. I never even heard of this movie, and I actually really liked that. So we decided we're not going to do that again because we've been there, done that. So instead, Brian and I are doing a special 5-part little limited series where we're going to go over the decades of horror. And for anyone who's watched our channel, you guys know we don't rarely go past the 80s. So we're going to start at the 80s and then do 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and then the 2020s. So today, we are starting with the 1980s, which is when I was born. So that's really where my introduction to horror was coming in. So we're going to kind of go over the landscape of the 80s horror, the top tier franchises at that time, as well as go over what our underrated horror movies are, our overrated horror movies, and then our top 5 horror films, maybe a little, honorable mentions out of those. But yeah, Brian, what were your thoughts on this miniseries? You cool with this? You like this? Like, what are we going?
No, like you said that, especially when I have, whether it be through this or through any day-to-day life, when I have people come to me and say, hey, I like this movie you recommended, things like that. That's my favorite part of doing any of this kind of stuff. I love to, push my opinions on other people is always fun, but also to introduce them to things that they might not know of. Because I love when somebody's recommended something to me and I check it out and like, how did I not know about this movie? This is awesome. I love it. So I kind of love being able to kind of pass that on to people who maybe aren't as knowledgeable, or at least as far as awareness of some movies. So I love to kind of push that on people. So I love the idea of the series. We talk about the underrated. We always love bashing the overrated. If we did 70s Exorcist, you'd be number 1.
Oh, absolutely.
I just lost our audience. Bye. But
they've heard us say that so many times by now. If they're still watching, they've stuck around or they agree.
They've just accepted it. Yeah.
Yes.
So I love the idea of the series. We did decide to break it up by decades, so we can do something through all of October. As far as the earlier decades, like you said, we don't have nearly as much knowledge of stuff before the 80s. I've seen lots of them. I actually do like a lot of like the old classics, going all the way back to like Nosferatu, and silent movies and stuff like that. But as far as where we really had enough that we really wanted to talk about, 80s is kind of where it started.
Exactly. The 70s, there's some great horror films in there. Same thing with the 60s and even further back. Even going back to your Universal monsters. Even though I think Bride of Frankenstein is severely overrated. It's so fucking annoying. That whole movie is annoying as hell. But I agree. The 80s is kind of where, not necessarily where horror skyrocketed, but that is where, when you look at people who want to talk about iconic horror, that is where the birth of horror. Yes, Michael Myers was literally a year or two before the 80s. I believe. Yeah, it was like 78. And then, but this is when Freddy came in. This is when Jason, Chucky. This is where literally kind of almost the birth of franchise horror really started. And that's kind of why we started with the 80s here. So judging, like I said, I was born in 85, so I came halfway through. And I also probably wasn't watching horror that much in the 80s. So I've had to kind of do like a refresh, go back and watch it over the course of my life doing this. So Brian, since you have more of the knowledge for the 80s, why don't you kick us off with the overview of the 80s?
So I was born in the early 70s. So, even by the time I hit the 80s, I wasn't really old enough to be that into horror. But then, towards the late 80s, when I was in high school and that, I lived at the video store. This is the height of video store rentals, things like that. I knew people that worked there. I spent most of my free time, if I wasn't at home, I was probably there hanging out in the video store with friends. And like you said, this is kind of the boom of that 80s horror. The VHS era had really kicked into gear, because the 70s had kind of had the kind of really low budget kind of trashy horror that would show in some seedy theater with 30 seats in like, New York City, and then would eventually, you might just catch it on TV and that. And then it had like the kind of wannabe highbrow horror, of like the Rosemary's Baby or even like The Exorcist and things like that. They were trying to be a little artsier. But the 80s with the VHS boom, it kind of became this whole new era because it'd have a lot of stuff released directly to video. As well as, like you said, it was kind of the dawn of the slashers. You had your Freddy, you had your Jason, you had Hellraiser started then, Child's Play started then. And of course, Halloween, just the first one we came out in 78, that came into its own. So it's kind of, I think, probably the biggest horror boom since the Universal Monsters, honestly. So that was what really kicked into gear there. Other franchises you had started out, we had Creepshow started out, Evil Dead started out there, Fright Night, and then Silent Night, Deadly Night, Toxic Avenger, which we may eventually see a new one. Who knows? So
it's out there somewhere, just nowhere for us to watch it.
But that's the thing is, besides the big one, the big 3 or 4 that you know of with the Freddy and Jason, things like that, this all started in the 80s. But besides that, there were so many like smaller franchises. Like I said, a lot of that just thrived mostly just on VHS at the time. But it really was kind of horror coming into its own and kind of coming back after being, I mean, in the 80s, it was still, I think, looked down upon genre. It wasn't classy like the, dramas and things like that. But it was definitely popular. It was huge. I mean, movies never did giant box office, but there were so many of them that it was like constant stream of horror movies.
Horror movies, and honestly, all the way up to even still today by certain standards, everyone always looks at horror as like your trash movies. It's like trash TV. It's like back in the 80s, 90s, it was like, oh, if you watch soap operas, you're watching trash TV. Now it's reality TV. It's trash TV. Horror has always been that kind of trash movie, genre. But everyone
sometimes that's what you want to watch.
Exactly. Everyone watches it. And if you don't, you're either lying or you're just absolutely terrified of horror films, the most basic horror, and you just can't handle blood, gore, or you're just easily scared and you don't like being scared. Because I have a few people I know who are like, well, I don't watch anything horror. It's like, you're missing out on so much.
Yeah, I honestly don't. I almost kind of envy people that get scared of horror movies. I don't get scared. I get startled occasionally, by a jump scare or something like that. And I can think of a very few, 3 or 4 circumstances where I've been like really creeped out watching a movie. But for the most part, I don't know, just because I'm so into movies that, I just see it as a movie and whatever. But I actually envy those people because I wish I could feel scared like that.
Yeah, like with me, when I was a kid, obviously I got scared because I was a kid. You don't know anything.
Now, when did you get when did you start kind of watching horror movies? At what age?
This is gonna sound bad, but it's not. But so I was like probably like 4. So it was like 89.
Oh, this explains so much.
What's that?
That explains so much about you, Sean.
Yeah. And I remember like my brothers would be downstairs watching something, and I'm not supposed to be down there watching her. I'm supposed to be in my other room playing. And so that's when I would like sneak down and I would like hide behind the couch, and I'd like be laying on the couch and I'd be peeking my head out. And that's like, I think the first horror movie I think I remotely remember watching, or at least peeking and watching, was Poltergeist. And I was just so like, oh my God, what the hell is on screen? Because I have never seen anything like this. I mean, like at my age, like Ghostbusters was probably the closest thing to horror that I'd ever touched. And then here's this movie where a tree's trying to eat a boy. There's a killer clown doll. There's skeletons and all this stuff that's not animated like Disney Halloween specials kind of thing. And I was just like, what the hell is this? And so whenever I knew my brothers were downstairs, I was like, okay, I got to try to make my way down there at some point to see what the hell they're watching. And there'd be times where it'd be like Puppet Master or one of the Puppet Masters or something like that. And then, it got to a point where they were getting older and it wasn't horror anymore that was on screen. And that was a whole other different, like, what the hell is this? If you guys know exactly where I'm going with that, that was a whole other opener for me. But definitely, that was my introduction to horror. But when my real, like, open the doors, I'm officially like a horror fan, because like all the way up until about probably 10 or 11, I probably would like catch the occasional horror movie, but like my parents were just like, no, you're not going to watch this. And so like I wouldn't watch Freddy or Jason or anything like that. But there would be occasional time where I'd be able to sneak one and be able to watch it or catch at least glimpses of it. Like I remember like Nightmare on Elm Street. I think I've watched scenes of Nightmare on Elm Street like 1,000 times before I actually got to sit down and actually watch the whole thing through. But, you know, in 95, I moved to Nebraska and I met my best friend there now, who's been my best friend ever since. And his mom, you know, single mom, divorcee, he got everything he wanted. She goes, here's my Hollywood Video members card. During the summer, go there and rent, 2 to 5 videos. You don't have to pay for anything. Just show them the card and you can go. So every day that Halloween, Ryan and I would walk to Hollywood Video, which was like 2 miles away. Because back then, you were allowed to do that without being worried about being picked up and taken anywhere. So we would leave our house, 10 years old. I think Ryan was actually 9. And we would walk to Hollywood Video, and we would literally just start at A for horror. We'd pick 2 to 5 movies. They would let us rent it out because her card said over 18 allowed. They didn't stop us. We'd walk all the movies back home, watch them all. Next day, return them, go to the next 5 and the next 5. And that whole summer, we went through that entire horror section. And then I think after the horror section, it was like, oh, let's watch other things. We started watching like UFC 1. It's like, what the hell? Because we're pro wrestling fans. They were like, oh, what's this? Like, this is violent, But that was kind of like we called it like our summer of horror because I think we watched like 200-300 horror movies. Now, granted, like if you check my Letterboxd, there's probably like 150 of those movies that I watched, but I just don't remember anymore. So they're probably not even scored that I watched. But that was kind of my introduction to horror. And then, of course, right at that point, you had the big boom of the screams coming through. And at that point, everyone was kind of introduced to horror through Scream and New Nightmare and everything from there. So that was kind of like my beginning. And at that point, too, my parents were like, look, you're 10. As long as you don't have nightmares and you're not waking us up at night, cool. Watch it. Have fun. Don't become like a serial killer. I was like, okay. So that was kind of my big thing. But like in the 80s, yeah, I didn't really have much. So like my introduction to 80s horror was the summer of horror where we would go back and we would watch these movies. And I got to see, Jamie Lee Curtis and her, Scream Queen glory. It was outside of Halloween. It was a prom night or something like that that she was in. Yeah. So it was like, oh, that's the girl from, this, and this. And I was like, oh, damn, she was in Halloween also. So like most of these movies I didn't start watching until I was about 10, which probably would have been where you were in the 80s at that point. So
honestly, I was a little later coming to horror because I have an older brother and sister, but they weren't really into movies, much less horror. And it wasn't that my parents wouldn't let me watch them. It just never was a thing. But like, it was really, I think video stores created so many horror fans because it was the same thing. I went there, and I'd spend a whole lot of time just doing nothing but renting videos. And so I think it was probably already in junior high. So I was like 11 or 12 years old when I kind of started watching horror. And a friend of mine and I we went through the, the Freddy movies and the Jason movies and all those kind of things. And then we started going a lot of that straight to video kind of schlock, which, I've gone back and watched some of the things now that I saw back then. I'm like, some of these are really horrible movies.
They're god awful.
At the time we enjoyed it. It's like, oh, cool, blood, creative kills, whatever.
Stuff that we weren't technically allowed to watch. So naturally,
it's just the whole forbidden aspect of it made it more appealing. But it's the kind of thing you should probably just leave in your memory, most of those, because don't rewatch them. It won't like
most old school animated shows that we loved when we were kids and we tried to watch them. They're like, this is annoying.
Oh, not just animated, man. I grew up on things like, the A-Team and the Incredible Hulk TV show. And it's like, oh, those are horrible shows. You go back and watch them now.
Oh, yeah. Try to watch an episode of Full House now and not want to bash your brain in with the.
But I was in high school, I think, before I really started watching horror. So even when I was just like 14, 15 years old, though, so it wasn't necessarily, old enough technically to be watching them. But again, none of it really, I think I was old enough that none of it scared me. None of it terrified me. But I really enjoyed it. I had a subscription to Fangoria magazine at that point, so I knew like all the new movies coming out, even the low budget shit. And I'd go to the video store and be like, hey, when you get this movie? And if they didn't have it, like, order this movie. And half the time they would, just because, they're like, hey, this kid knows about horror.
Speaking of Fangoria, since you brought it up, I obviously didn't get the subscription for that because my parents weren't going to pay for that. But whenever we would,
I had
and
paper route money.
we're going to date ourselves madly if we haven't already yet.
I just did
whenever
I had a paper route, so yeah.
Whenever we would go to the mall, I would always go into Walden Books. And whenever I was like, oh, yeah, my parents are looking at books and shit, I was always in the magazine section. And I would always grab Fangoria like it was a fucking Playboy and like be trying to like. Because I was like, I'm a kid. I shouldn't be looking at this. And I was like, but I was like looking at all the like bloody horror stuff. And I treated it like it was a fucking Playboy. Like I tried to I'd grab it and I'd go like try to find a corner where no one could see me because I thought I'd get in trouble for looking at it and shit. But yeah, I was always kind of the same with you. I was like, once I like went through the summer of horror with Ryan, I wasn't necessarily, I guess the scared all got scared out of me because I was never really scared watching them because we watched them during the day. And it just, I kind of just watched it. It's like, oh, this is cool. But like, and then there would be like a moment where it's like, okay, I'm trying to lay down and my brain all of a sudden immediately starts playing that in my brain, and I was like, stop, and I could stop it. So like for me, I always chalk up horror films. I know they're good if I'm watching it, I'm just watching it like this, but then all of a sudden it kicks up a notch and I go, like, if you get me to raise up out of my chair and just go, then okay, good. Because I'm not gonna get scared. But if you
I never feel suspense though.
And like just like that, then okay, then this was a great movie. Other people might terrify, but I'm not gonna get that like hair on the back of my neck, terrified kind of thing. But if you got me to like just, not that I'm a talker, but if you got me to just go locked in, that's the equivalent of scared for me, is that I am zeroed in on this film. And there's not a lot of horror movies that do that. There are a lot where I'm watching them like, these are effective kills, but there's 8 things that make this movie bad. But then it's like there's other ones. Most recently, like I said, I did the review for Strange Darling, and I was more like, this is not scary, but it's doing enough to intrigue the hell out of me to just go, I'm locked in on this. Yeah. And that's an effective horror film for what it is. It's not going to give you nightmares. It might make you worry about certain people when you meet them and try to do stuff, but it was enough for me to go, this is effective as shit, and it's a really good horror film. And there are a lot of movies that we're going to be talking about like that were not necessarily scary films for Brian and I, because we're twisted, so we don't get scared, but enough to the point where we were able to focus on the good, because there's a lot of bad. And Brian knows this, and I think Brian's a little bit the same way. When we review horror films, I don't want to say we're harder on them, but we hold them to a higher standard. Because nothing annoys me more than when the horror cliches come into play, especially nowadays. Like the woman who randomly trips over nothing so that way the killer can catch up. Or characters just being overtly stupid because the plot needs them to be. Like that shit, it's fine.
Or movies that the only thing they do is just constant jump scares. Like a good place jump scare can be good, but when that's the only horror of the movie.
Every 5 seconds, it's like after a while, it's like you're in a haunted house. You're like, yeah, I already know it's coming. You've telegraphed this entire movie to be a jump scare. But it's like in the 80s and 90s, like that was the trope. That's what they did. That's fine. But once you enter the 2000s and to today, if you're still doing that same cliche shit that's been barreled into our brains a million times, I'm sorry, I'm going to dock you for it, because you should be better than that. Don't call it a throwback, because horror is the one thing you don't want to do a throwback on, because it's not like when I talked about like Jackpot or the shows, like this is a throwback to 90s comedies. Like this is actually a lot of fun. Horror, you try to do a throwback, you have to be perfect for it, because if not, it just looks cheap and lazy, and it just looks like you guys really had no plan. You guys had like a general thought, and then you guys ran with that and just wrote around that thought, and there was no actual well thought out motion for the rest of the film. So I tend to hold horror to a higher standard, but when it works, I will praise it to the fucking mountains, how amazing this horror film is. And a lot of times I'm praising a movie and Brian was like, it was fine. I was like, when it worked on me for XYZ, and then you have movies like Terrifier 2 with Brian, where he was just like, I want everyone to see it, and I want to make sure I'm watching you see it. And I'm watching, I was like, yeah, I mean, it's fine. And Brian's just like, this is the greatest. And I was just like, Yeah, but there's this, and this wrong. I don't care. It's great. It's like horror is one of those genres that everyone, if you're willing to watch it, everyone's gonna find something that works for them. It could be torture porn, like your Saws and your Hostels. It could be slashers. It could be ghosts. It could be what are they called that you hate? Like Hereditary. It's not high.
Elevated.
Thank you. Elevated horror. It could be found footage, which we'll be talking about that when we get into the 90s and 2000s. It could be schlocky. It could be serious. There's so many subgenres. It's like saying you're a fan of rock music. It's like, well, there's like 20 different versions of rock music. So which rock are you just a fan of it all, or are you a fan of like grunge, or it's like you got to figure it out. So everyone's gonna find one that's gonna work for them. It's just, are you only a fan of that, or do you like all of it but you like some a little bit better than most? Like my girlfriend, she loves horror. She likes more of the like ghosts and like haunted aspects, but then she also really enjoys like bloody, gory slasher films like Terrifier and stuff like that. But if I show her something like Hereditary, she understands that it's very well acted and that it's interesting, but the horror stuff doesn't really come in till literally in the last like 20 minutes. So for her, it can be a little, drawing and daunting, because it's just like, all right, I'm kind of getting a little bored. I was like, well, you watch the movie for what it is, which is a dramatic portrayal of family guilt and stuff, which Brian hates Hereditary. So we're going to talk about that when we get to the 2010s. But as long as you're boom, 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 she loves it. And she loves watching horror. 13 Ghosts is a favorite of hers, because it's hitting her with, all this stuff. It's really poorly acted, but it's a fun horror film to watch. And everyone's going to have their thing. And then when you find someone who likes the same shit as you, then it's like, it's almost like it's a lot like being a pro wrestling fan. You find someone out in the wild that's a pro wrestling fan too, and he's like, oh, cool, do you like the same shit I like? Cool, we're buds. And horror is all like that. Yeah, exactly. We're best friends now? Okay. It's like you just got to kind of find your group. And, and then like Brian and I, we found ourselves, and it wasn't necessarily based on horror. I think it was, I'm trying to remember what our legit like moment where we were like, yeah, you and me.
I think it was when we started talking about old TV shows, honestly.
I think it was old TV shows, and then we both had the same kind of humor, because whenever we were in our group chats with other people, you would make a joke, and I would be the only one really laughing, and then I would make the same kind of joke, and you were still the only one laughing.
I'm an acquired taste.
Yeah. Exactly. And then I think we both agreed that we hate Napoleon Dynamite. I think that might have been the actual moment, is that we both hated Napoleon Dynamite, and everyone else jumped on our ass for it. And horror, Brian and I, we don't always see eye to eye on horror.
Oh no!
I still remember, was it last year or 2 years ago? Malignant. That was a fun experience.
Which I still maintain. We'll talk about when we get to the 2020s, but just briefly,
Yeah.
Malignant's a movie that I enjoyed watching. Malignant, but not for the reasons they wanted you to enjoy for Malignant. It was like one of those things I was shaking my head like, what the fuck is going on right now? Which, yeah, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that when we get to 2020s. But like, you just got to find your right people. And Brian's my people. And there are other friends of ours that are our people, but Brian is the only one that loves to actually get on camera and talk to me about this set stuff.
Well, and like you said, I mean, not everybody has the same taste, because I think horror, almost more than any other genre, kind of is one of the genres that is the most likely to be kind of guilty pleasures. Because Absolutely. A lot of them are going to be low budget. A lot of them are going to be badly acted. A lot of them are not going to be, anything, have a whole lot to say. I mean, some of them, horror certainly can have a lot to say in social commentary and things like that, but a lot of them really don't. And horror is one of those genres that largely is designed just for entertainment. And so there are a lot of guilty pleasures. There's a lot of movies that we will admit, this is not a good movie, but I have a hell of a fun time watching it.
Oh, there's going to be so many movies that when we're talking about here that he's going to go, oh, I'm going, no, I love this movie. Or vice
versa. I'm okay with that. Yeah,
exactly. Because this is not like, Brian hating the Batman or Dune and being going, dude, come on. It's horror is an acquired taste, which is why we're doing this.
Yes.
Now, let's piss everyone off and talk about our most overrated films of the 1980s. Yeah. Now, we're not going to go through a full top 10. We're only talk about 2 or 3. And this is where, like I said, I don't know what Brian's gonna pick. He doesn't know what I'm gonna pick. This is where that's what I love about horror. It's because there's so many over the decade. If we get something that's exactly, when we get to later years, we're probably gonna be more on point. I'm super intrigued to see what he thinks is overrated compared to what I think is overrated. Outside of the 70s, which we both would have picked The Exorcist, I'm really interested in seeing where he's gonna go with this. So, Brian, what were your overrated films?
All right. So my first overrated one is one that I honestly never even heard of before somebody suggested it to me a couple years ago. But then I look at it and it's got like an average rating of 4.1 on Letterboxd. You know, all the ratings are in like the top 3 slots essentially. It's a movie from 1981 called Possession. This is a movie that stars Isabella Adjani. Sam Neill is a very early role in that. But it's kind of one of those mindfuck kind of movies. There's like a lot of weird, creepy imagery going on. It's a whole thing about demon possession and stuff like that. But it's one of those movies trying to be weird for the sake of being weird. It's way too long. It's not very good. She's acting completely bizarre. Her acting, I think in my review I called it. I said, "Imagine Marriage Story with a bizarre paranormal twist and directed by The Room's Tommy Wiseau." That's how I defined this movie in the first line of my review, because it's one big what the fuck movie. Which there are plenty of what the fuck movies. I'm willing to write them off. I would just say, okay, that movie sucked, move on. But then when I saw how highly people rated this movie, and when I got attacked for my review of this movie, I'm like, I don't know what it is that I'm missing, or if they watched a different movie than I did. But based on just the numbers here, it is one of the most overrated movies of the decade.
Do you have 2 or 3?
I have 3. I didn't know if you want to alternate.
Okay. I got 3 too. I just didn't know if you had. Then I was gonna go twice.
I pulled 3 for the 80s. Yeah.
Okay. Mine is.
Oh, I will say one on a plus side, Isabella Adjani naked multiple times. Just saying.
There's one thing that you can always count on when it comes to horror is nudity. So, well, not all the time, but when you want it, it's great. When you really, really want it and they don't show it, you're like, oh, you sons of bitches. But yeah, my first one, I think this movie was probably highly rated back when it came out. I doubt it, but I think over the course of the 2000s to now, this has become a cult favorite. It's definitely memed like crazy and gift like crazy. I finally watched this for the first time, I think last year, and I can't remember why we watched it. I think we watched it for maybe something Halloween related, and that's Vampire's Kiss. I think everyone knows the Nick Cage gif of like him going like this, and then the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and no one really knew what the fuck it was from. And then it was like, oh, it's from this movie. And then you go and you look at people's like reviews, and I think it's like the best thing ever. I watched this movie. This movie's fucking stupid. This movie is atrociously bad. And if you're watching it for the Nick Cage-isms, I mean, congratulations. This is Nick Cage and his most Nick Cage. But that doesn't make it good either. This movie is just complete and utter nonsense the whole way through. There's so many points in this movie where I just threw my hands up. I was like, this is so fucking dumb. And everyone's just like, dude, no, man, this is great. I was like, no, it's really fucking not. Like, you guys are just all in the like Nick Cage love of it all that you guys can't pay attention that this movie's actually garbage. And how Nick Cage had the career he's had after this film boggles my mind, because this is one of those Razzie Award films that he should have won for, and then we would have never heard of Nick Cage again. This is one of those like, man, if you guys want to watch a real shit film with a shit actor, this dude. But now he's fucking Nick Cage, and he's unstoppable. He's allowed to be schlocky and over the top and stupid, and you love him for it. And this must have been his first real go of it. But yeah, Vampire's Kiss. It's a stupid film. It's dumb as shit. And the performances are atrocious through the entire way.
Vampire's Kiss almost qualifies as a guilty pleasure of mine, but wouldn't say that I really really like the movie all that much. I even admit full on it's not a good movie. Um, and Nicolas Cage is giving maybe one of the worst performances I've ever seen in my life. But I also think it's never boring. It's one of those things like I watched this thing and I was kind of entertained and kind of just glued to the screen just because I'm like, what is going on here? How is this a movie? Um, and I very much felt that way. And it's the kind of thing that I think I probably would revisit every few years just because it's kind of fun in how bad it is. But it absolutely is a bad movie.
Once was
Overrated,
enough for me.
overrated, maybe. But I think most people who love this movie love it for those reasons. I don't think anyone looks at this movie and thinks it's a good movie, but I can absolutely see it making your list.
The reason why it's overrated for me is because I had so many people praising this movie to me,
Mm.
and then I finally watched it, and this was the garbage that I got. I'm not talking about like ratings, like it was getting like a 98% on Rotten, but it's like when it'd be no different if like we told someone, hey, you really check this movie's great, and then they thought they hated it. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, it's overrated then for them, but it's not for us. But yeah, I mean, it'd be one thing that if he did this today, because Nick Cage has garnered that clout. He can get away with that shit today. This is when he just started. So how the fuck he kept going
I
with
almost
this?
think it's one of those ones where they give you one because this is, I think, just a year after Moonstruck, which was kind of a big breakthrough for him, and it was an Oscar-nominated film and things like that. And so it's one of those movies like he probably already had this one in the can. So it's like when Halle Berry does Monsters or not, does Catwoman right after winning an Oscar, or I'm trying to think Charlize Theron I think did Aeon Flux after she got a big role in something, and it's like I think they almost always give somebody one. Like, okay, you got your bad now. You got to prove yourself from now on. And so they must have given him a pass because I agree. I'm not sure, just based on that performance, how his career would have survived after that.
All right, that's my easy one. The next two are gonna go.
Yeah, well,
because
because here's the thing: is my next two go in the category of movies that are fine, but hugely overrated. Next one I'm going to go with is also 1981, An American Werewolf in London. I'm not sure if there's ever been a good werewolf movie. There have been some that are better than others. Some are okay, but they've never really quite nailed down the werewolf thing. People praise this movie for the practical effects, especially the transformation, which it looks kind of cheesy, especially by today's standards. But at the time, I can see that it was impressive. It didn't just cut away and come back to a werewolf. It had the progression of it. You kind of saw the transformation. That was kind of cool. Um, it's a movie that has trouble with its tone. Like at time, it is trying to be a comedy. At times, it's trying to be straight hardcore horror, which I'm okay with that. Sometimes you play around with the genres, but it's just the whole movie come together to be okay for me. I didn't hate this movie. I definitely didn't love this movie, but it is praised by a lot of people as the best horror movie of all time, and I just don't see it.
this is why Brian's my peoples, because this is also on my list. To have as many horror films as there are, and we both picked one in the same. This was my number one, but I'll go ahead and talk about it now. I agree with Brian pretty much on everything he said. There hasn't really been a good werewolf movie. There's been good movies that has a werewolf in it, but when the central character or the central monster is a werewolf, I don't understand how no one's been able to crack this formula yet. There have been like average ones, and they're just straight bad. It's like shark movies. You have like Jaws, and you have like The Shallows, and to an lesser extent Deep Blue Sea, and then everything else is just fucking garbage. Werewolves movies, this is like to most people the pinnacle outside of like The Wolfman. This is the pinnacle of werewolf films, and this movie was boring to me. Like, not to mention the fucking ending of this film. I hate the ending of this damn movie so damn much. But I agree, you got the practical effects element, which I think we've all seen even before you saw this movie, much like Vampire's Kiss, you've all seen the, transformation scene with the guy's hand like this. You're like, what's this from? It's like, oh, it's from this movie. And then of course you got his buddy following him around after, he's dead and stuff. But it's just, I remember watching this going, if you were to quiz me on this movie right after I watched it, I would fail because I don't remember anything that I just watched, because that is how memorable this film was to me. And like I said, you hear everyone just talking about this movie with utter praise, and it's just all right. That
It's
was
the
a
kind of movie
thing.
that if I had been older in 1981 and I had seen it when it first came out, maybe I would currently still hold it in, high regard out of some sense of nostalgia, or seeing it back then when it was something new and groundbreaking with the effects and things like that. But having come to it later, there's nothing for me. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we both had the same one there. So go ahead with your last one.
Oh, Sean and I are not going to agree on this one. My last one is another one I think is a fine movie. I enjoy this movie to some extent, not nearly as much as everyone else in the world seems to. And this is going into the category of sci-fi horror, and this is John Carpenter's The Thing. The Thing is a movie that I watched long ago. Thought it was, forgot about it. Then when I got more into movies as I got older, I kind of got into movie circles and communities, everything praising this movie. It's so great. It's one of the best horror films of all time, especially in the sci-fi horror area. And I rewatch it and I'm still kind of like, eh. And this is one where people praise the practical effects again. But again, if you look at it at the time, it probably was, and this is what 82, so only a year after Werewolf. I'm sure they were cutting edge. I'm sure they were, cool to see something new and innovative. But you look at it now, and they're honestly not very good practical effects, in my opinion. I think that they look a little cartoony. Everything looks fake. And yes, when you watch a movie, you just buy into it. Especially when I first saw this back in the day, when I wasn't older, and you kind of just accept things. It's like watching those old, Ray Harryhausen stop motion skeletons and things like that. It doesn't look real, but you just let yourself go into the movie, and I can do that. But I'm just saying, people praise the special effects, and at the time they're fine, but But this is a movie that I think is good. I enjoy it. I just not nearly as much as everybody else, and I find it highly overrated. I know Sean disagrees though.
I haven't. I watched The Thing for like the first time that one year. You made me watch the remake first. So
you had it rated like 4.5 stars on Letterboxd.
For what it is,
yeah.
It's a really good film, but it's nowhere on my list for this. Because because like I said, there's movies that I will watch, and I'll be like, you know what? For what they went out to do, elements wise, it was Alaska or wherever the hell they're at. I was like, effective cast, great, special effects. Yeah, special effects for what it was at the time, great. But I didn't like the ending of it. It's a really good film. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a really great film. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's a really great film. Is it something that I would rewatch over and over and over and over again? No. It was I watched it, and then I watched the remake with our beloved Mary Elizabeth Winstead.
Remake, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I was kind of like you. It was like, it's not as strong as the original, but I think I enjoyed.
I disagree. I like the
one
one
more. I enjoy watching that one more than the original. So no, I'm fine with that one being classified as an overrated. Just because I have a high score for it doesn't mean that I'm going to praise it up the mountains. I can just, hell, I can give a 4.5 star to something like some boring ass prestigious film. I was like, yeah, for what they set out to do, they fucking did it. But that doesn't mean I loved the movie. I was just like, yeah, it's a great film. I'm not gonna tell everyone they need to go out and check that damn thing out. The Thing you should check out just because of what it is. But no, it's not even in my top 8 for horror films in 1980s. But yeah, no, it's like, what's that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was moving on. But keep going.
Oh yeah, but yeah, no, no. Now mine, I think you're gonna probably be more inclined on. I don't think it's gonna make your top 5. If it is, then I apologize. But mine was another one that you hear about ad nauseum as one of the scariest movies of all time. One of the best performances. It's been spoofed and memed like crazy over the years. And I only watched it because it had a sequel coming. And I was like, well, I got to watch the sequel. Or I got to watch this before I watch the sequel. And then I watched this and I'm like, I'm bored. And that's The Shining. Yeah, Jack Nicholson's great in this film. Shelley Duvall is fucking awful in this movie.
I think she did better acting than Olive Oil in Popeye, honestly.
That's saying something, but yes, I agree. Yes, I know what she went through while shooting this. I know all the stuff. But yeah, I mean, you get a movie that's so spoofed and mean through the decades that by the time you finally sit down and actually watch said film, it loses its luster, it loses its persona. And I only watched this because Doctor Sleep was coming out. And for anyone who has actually seen Doctor Sleep, Doctor Sleep is far superior of a film than The Shining. I have never been the hugest Stanley Kubrick fan. He's a fine director. It's just his movies, much like the Coens, his movies are not my tempo. His movies are not my kind of films. I can respect them for what they do and how they do their things, but they're not ones that really stick out to me as movies that I enjoy watching. Stanley Kubrick's right there with me. But The Shining, it's like, okay, it's going to have all this stuff. And I'm watching it and I'm like, time check. Time check. Time check. Yeah, okay, I already know everything's going to happen because I've seen how everything happens. But because you see this and it's like, cool, I want to watch the in-between parts. I want to see the full story. And I'm watching, I'm like, I probably could have gone without seeing the in-between parts because the in-between parts really didn't do much to make this better an experience for me. I think everything that spoofed it did it better, to be honest. Hell, I think Ready Player One did a better job of making The Shining scarier than The Shining did. I respect it for what it did. I respect it for, at the time, how it made everyone feel. But The Shining to me is not. It's not something that I enjoy. I would never go back and rewatch The Shining. Never.
Yeah, The Shining. I agree with everything you just said. I think it's a decent movie. It's got some good parts to it. But if you try to rewatch the entire movie, it is slow. I've also not been a fan of Stanley Kubrick. Of his movies, this is probably one of the ones I like the most, but that's not saying so much about this movie as it is about the other movies. Because I'm not a fan of his really at all. Yeah, the performances are fine. It's another movie has some good creepy imagery, some good parts to it, especially when Jack finally goes over the edge in the last act. But I would agree with this one as a pick for the list because it's
yeah.
I would watch Dr. Sleep. We'll talk about definitely when we get to 2010s, but far.
Yeah. If I want to watch The Shining, I'll just watch the Simpsons Halloween special version of The Shining because they did it better. The Shining. You want to get sued? But yes, now underrated. So these are movies that many of you probably have never heard of. Maybe some of you have. They're not necessarily good films, but these are the films that are special to us that maybe didn't make our top 5. I've got 3. Honestly, I got like 5. But, okay, I'll go first. Quick nods of the hat to these other 2 because they're like right outside of my top 5 for the 80s, and I consider them underrated as well. One is Once Bitten with Jim Carrey. Straight up comedy, but it's got horror elements because it's vampires and Draculas. This was my first introduction to Jim Carrey before Ace Ventura. I honestly didn't even recognize that was the same actor at my age until like Jim Carrey became fucking huge. Like, oh yeah, that's the guy from Once Bitten. I watched Once Bitten so many fucking times when I was a kid, not realizing that it was considered a horror movie technically. So yeah, that's one that I love that most people either probably have seen because of Jim Carrey, but if you're not a fan of Jim Carrey, you probably never checked it out, and it's actually really good. And of course, one of my favorite films as a child, and still to this day, but it did not make my list, which is probably going to be shocking to Brian because Brian knows how much I love this movie. Monster Squad. I love Monster Squad with every fiber of my being. It is schlocky. It is not well acted. And if you watch it now, you're like, I can see all the holes and all the problems with this film, but this was my go-to fucking movie outside of Jaws until Jurassic Park came out in the 90s. This was my go-to film. I watched Monster Squad until I wore out the fucking VHS. Werewolves Got Nards. This is probably the best version of a werewolf in a film. It's the way they did the Universal monsters in this movie. The way it was kind of like I'm not a big fan of the Goonies, this is my Goonies. Monster Squad's my Goonies. I love Monster Squad with every fiber of my being, but a lot of people do know what Monster Squad is. Not to mention their song at the end. I used to sing that song all the fucking time when I was little. Now to my actual underrated. This one Brian made me watch, I think for Crusaders. And I went into it with like, kind of expectations, but I actually enjoyed quite a bit. And that was Near Dark. Yeah, it was like, there's not really much you can say about it. I mean, it's just kind of like, I think most people don't know Near Dark because, oh God, I'm blanking on the other vampire film. Kiefer Sutherland vampire film.
Lost Boys.
Lost Boys came out right around the same kind of time frame, right? Didn't they come around within a couple years? And I think a lot of people just
Lost Boys 87, Monster Squad was it
no, I'm talking about Near Dark and Lost Boys.
Oh, Near Dark. Yeah, it was also 87. So yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like this was like those sister movies kind of thing where people like, Lost Boys was Lost Boys, and then like here was Near Dark. And I don't feel like enough people like just kind of paid attention to Near Dark. I mean, you've got the always great Bill Paxton in this, and he is so fucking good in this movie. You got Lance Hendrickson, Adrian Pasdar, which most people, I know him from Heroes. That was my introduction to him in this. But this is a really good like horror like vampire movie, and I feel like I never had heard of it until we started doing Crusaders, and I think you chose it for it, and I was like, I don't even know what the hell this movie is, and I watched it like, it's actually a pretty damn good horror film or vampire movie. And I was like, well, how have I never heard about this? It was, this came at the around the time Lost Boys came out, and everyone knows what Lost Boys is. But yeah, Near Dark definitely is one that I was like, this deserves to be at least acknowledged as an.
Yeah, this is the one that it's never going to make like a best of list for me for horror movies. But it's definitely one that's kind of, I think, underrated and underseen. Most of it for me is the great cast to it. Bill Paxton, of course. It's got that whole kind of, because this was directed by Catherine Bigelow, who back in the time when she was like with James Cameron, so she was like helping produce some of his movies, things like that. So you had a lot of those people from like Aliens and Terminator. I think they had Lance Henriksen. You had Jeanette Goldstein. You have Bill Paxton, of course, things like that. And it's definitely kind of a, whereas Lost Boys, for the comparisons, like I said, it's the same year, is kind of the glossier Hollywood movie about vampires. This is just kind of like that, almost like a gritty, almost like a grindhouse kind of vampire flick. And it is, I will say, it is slow in parts. When I rewatched, I'm kind of like, okay, it's a little slower, but I still very much enjoy this movie, and it definitely belongs on the underrated list. I considered it for mine, but I did not put it.
What's yours?
The first one I will go with. I'm gonna go with one it's classified on Letterboxd as horror, which is what I went by. More of a thriller in my eyes, but I'm still gonna count it just because I'm using Letterboxd. It's a movie from 1989 called Dead Calm. This is basically the story of a couple played by Sam Neill and Nicole Kidman. They're out on this boat, and they come across this guy who who seems to be in distress, and it's Billy Zane. They bring him on board their boat. Next thing you know, he's like holding them hostage and terrorizing them, and it's kind of a thriller from that point on. It's got a lot of suspenseful moments, a lot of good drama to it. It's Nicole Kidman's not her first movie, but I think her first like American movie. It's an Australian made movie, but it actually got a full release in the US. So it's kind of America's first exposure to her. Directed by Philip Noyce, who went on to do the Harrison Ford, Jack Ryan movies. He did Salt. He did a few other movies like that. Sam Neill, again, it's kind of one of the first times I think people really saw him, at least in a major role. So it's just, but it's almost, because it's the whole cast is essentially just these three people on a boat the entire time. So I mean, it could have been done as a play for that matter, but it's just really good, really suspenseful. And while it's not like your horror in terms of like blood and things like that, it's a great thriller.
My next one is the epitome of so bad that it's good, or guilty pleasure. I already know Brian's not a fan of this movie, so he's probably gonna go, ugh. This is a movie, little side story. I lived in Florida for like a year or two, and for some reason I feel like this movie was on like TV every fucking weekend, and I was at first scared of this movie because of one main reason, which as soon as I say the title, Brian's gonna know that main reason. But then I forced myself to watch this because I was like 8 when this came out, or not when it came out, but when I was watching this. But I just really enjoyed the movie for what it was. Like if you watch it now, like you realize how bad the movie is. But it's a cult classic to the upteenth level. That's Killer Clowns from Outer Space. I am terrified of clowns. Thank you, Pennywise from It, 1990. But for some reason, these clowns don't scare me. I love this. I unabashedly love this film. I love the way the clowns look. I love that they turn people into cotton candy. I love like the schlocky bad acting of this film. I'm pretty sure when they kill the clowns, they blow up into popcorn or something like that. If I remember, I haven't watched it in like over 10 years. I love how shitty this movie is, like how C-grade horror this movie is. But for damn if I'm wrong, this movie was on TV every fucking weekend. And I would find it, click it through the channels. If I found this movie on, it was always on and you know how I know? Because my parents got annoyed whenever I had it on TV. Because like, didn't you just watch this? I'm like, it's Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Yeah, there's not much more to say about this movie. I just really love this film for what it is. I know it's bad. But it has a special place in young Sean's heart. I know you're not a fan of it because I remember
I watched. It's one of those movies I saw on the shelf of the video store for decades. But for whatever reason, I never watched it. I didn't watch it until 2 years ago for the first time. I think for something that we were doing. Honestly.
I think you told me that, and I was like, "Oh my god, you're gonna love it." You're like,
and I get it. It's one of those things like maybe I wasn't in the right mood when I watched it because I can totally see it just being like fun on just kind of a schlocky, level. Yeah. But the one time I saw it, my next one is based on Stephen King. Honestly, it's actually an anthology movie though called Cat's Eye. I think of Stephen King's movies, it's one of the ones I think fewest people have seen, maybe because it is just an anthology. It's not like based on one of his major works like Carrie or The Shining or, Misery, things like that. It's basically comprised of 3 stories. The connection is just this cat that's wandering in and out for the 3 stories. It's the only way they connect it. But I think 2/3 of the stories are really good. There's one called Quitters Incorporated, which has James Woods as this guy who's trying to quit smoking. He goes to this organization that supposedly can help him, but they have these extreme methods. There's people like beat the shit out of you if they see you in your car in traffic, like waiting. At one point, they catch him smoking. They bring his wife in and basically are giving her electroshock as punishment for him, for smoking, things like that. But I think it's just a really kind of fun, and there's definitely comedy in it. It's definitely still a horror movie. That one's amusing. There's another one called The Ledge, which stars Robert Hayes, who you might know best probably from Airplane. He was the main character in Airplane. Where basically somebody makes a gambling bet with him. He can't make it all the way around this building, like just scooting along the edge of the building. And so there's just like a lot of suspense to that. I won't try to get into that. And the third one is Drew Barrymore. It's this little girl. There's like a cat trying to protect her from these goblins that come out of her wall. The stories individually, if you describe them, they sound weird. But it's an underrated film. Again, it's not going to make my best of list in any way, shape, or form, but it's one I think is worth seeing. I think the first 2 stories are especially very good.
My last one, I know Brian's never seen. Some don't even classify this as a movie. Some people classify this as an episode. But when I was a kid, I thought this movie was like 90 minutes long. It's actually like 46 minutes. And they made a sequel to it. So to me, it's a movie. It was a Disney horror. And this was another one of those movies this was like my introduction to horror. This was like I was saying, like I didn't watch horror till then unless it was like a Disney special thing. This was a Disney special horror, and I would watch this every year on Halloween when it came out. And it's actually on Disney Plus, so you guys can watch it if it's there. I'm not saying to do it because I have not watched it because I am afraid that it's going to be so fucking bad that I won't make it past 10 minutes. But for me, young Sean loved Mr. Boogedy. This was basically like the general concept of it was that a novelty salesman. Basically, he's a jokester, so he always has like the little want glasses or the nose, like or the funny face like glass thing. So he's just like an annoying like jokester dad. Moves his family into a new house, initially dismissing incidences as more of their father's practical jokes. The family soon learns that the house is haunted by people who lived in the house 300 years previously. And Mr. Boogedy is the closest thing to looking like Freddy Krueger for Disney standards. And he basically, kind of like Beetlejuice, he kind of just wants to like hook up with the young daughter in this, but they can't. You have to Disneyfy it, kind of thing. Because like the sequel's called Bride of Boogedy, and it's literally him trying to get with the daughter. But yeah, me as a kid, this was like the closest I could get to actual horror that I was allowed to watch. And I remember, like, spoiler to the end of this movie, the only way I think they found out like the guy, like Mr. Boogedy's cloak is his power, and to beat Mr. Boogedy, they suck his cloak up into the vacuum cleaner, and that's what stops him. That's Disney to the nth degree right there. But like as a kid, that was my go-to. And it's like, even by today's standards, I remember when Disney Plus came out and like, oh yeah, it's gonna have all the Disney stuff. My first thing was, does it have Mr. Boogedy? Because if it doesn't have Mr. Boogedy, then fuck you, Disney Plus. And sure enough, there was Mr. Boogedy. I don't know if the sequel's on there, but Mr. Boogedy is there. Like I said, I am not recommending this movie to anybody. I'm sure it sucks. But little Sean watched this movie. This was a Halloween tradition for me when I was a kid. For probably like my first 5-6 years being alive, I always watched this movie. So it's probably not underrated, but it's got a special place in my heart. I know Brian's had never seen this fucking film. He's probably looking up pictures of it going, oh God, this looks awful. But like it's got Richard Mosser, which most people know from It, Mimi Kennedy, David Facentino from Married with Children, Christy Swanson, good old old-fashioned Buffy because she played the daughter, John Astin, he's in it as well. So like it's got like an actual solid like 80s like early 90s type cast to it, which by today's standards most people aren't gonna know who the fuck most of these people are. But yeah, that was my like favorite outside of Monster Squad. That was like my favorite movie as a kid.
I had never heard of that movie until Disney Plus started, and people like in some of these forums talking about the movies that aren't on there yet. They want them to make sure they add it to it, and people started talking about Mr. Boogedy. I think it's because I was, by the time Disney Channel even really hit, and especially by the time I was kind of too old for that, so I didn't see that. I didn't see Halloween Town. I didn't see any of those kind of things. But it's one I've heard people talk about. So yeah. My last one, I've been debating between two. I'm gonna go with a Wes Craven movie.
You can say both.
I'm gonna go with a Wes Craven movie from 1988 called The Serpent and the Rainbow. Everyone, especially at the time, he was right in the middle of his Nightmare on Elm Street run. So that's kind of what Wes Craven did, and that was really all he was able to put out because they wanted one like every year. Although he only directed the first and the last one, but he was still like excellent producer and things on these. Serpent and the Rainbow is a movie Wes Craven came out with, though, that was it's stars Bill Pullman. Not really anybody else of note. A lot of faces I think you'll recognize. Paul Winfield, some other people like that, but he's the only like real known name in it. It basically takes place in Haiti, and it has to do with voodoo. So it's a lot about black magic and supernatural and things like that. And I know that like the big epic scene of it, at one point he gets buried alive. And it's one of those movies that it's just creepy beginning to end. I think Bill Pullman does a great dramatic performance, which by this point was just after Spaceballs. So I'm glad he pivoted and did something like this where he can show he has a little bit more range. He's not just a comedic actor, although he's still great at comedy. I love seeing him in everything. But it's a movie that I think went under a lot of people's radars. Even at the time, I don't think a lot of people watched this movie because they're more into like the big franchises of horror, and this is just kind of a one-off movie about voodoo horror, and it's one I think is worth checking out. Again, not going to make my best of list, but it's worth seeing.
Now we go to our top 5 horror films of the 1980s. This is, like I said, our favorites, not the best films, but our favorites. Like I said, there you have The Thing and all that kind of stuff, but these are the ones that we enjoy watching outside of our underrateds. I'll give a quick little nod because this is just outside of my top 5 to Evil Dead 2. I enjoy the hell out of it. It just didn't make my top 5. But my number 5, he's here right now, everybody. Or I always go the opposite. Hello, Gizmo. Gremlins. I love Gremlins. I love Mogwai and Gizmo and all this kind of stuff. Say what you will about the second one. The second one just went completely off the rails. But the first Gremlins film was actually a legit horror film. I love the setup of it. I love the practical effects of the film. I love the fucking Santa story that Phoebe Cates talks about to Zach Galligan's character. I was like, it's like everything about this movie just worked on such a great level. This is one of those movies that like you get like Critters or something. It's like, oh, this is a knockoff, or this is something that just is like this would be a one-off. And this movie just hits everything that it's supposed to. And I think it's one of those movies that's like you don't deserve to be as good as you are. Like you shouldn't be as good as you are. And Gremlins is one of those movies that like it's a Christmas horror, so you can watch it during Christmas time and not have to watch it during Halloween time. Like I said, the practical effects of the Gremlins and Gizmo himself is fantastic through this. The cast is full on support for this movie. Like I said, Phoebe Cates and John is it Galligan? Is that how you say his last name? Galligan. What's that?
Zach Galligan.
Galligan, yeah. I think they're both solid leads. Also, is it Hoyt Axton?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Hoyt Axton's great. Corey Feldman's got a part in this as well. I love this movie. It is so good. And then the sequel came out, and I was fine with the sequel, but the sequel just went, we're going zany just to go zany. But this one I thought was a perfectly well done Christmas horror film. That's my number 5.
It's actually my number 4, but I'll just chime in on it now because I agree. Gremlins is a great horror film, and yes, it's a horror film. It's kind of a horror comedy, almost a family film at times, but not really. It's kind of like one of those movies that I consider what I call gateway horror. It's something that kids can watch. I mean, obviously you have to know your kid and know if they're able to handle this kind of things, but kids can watch it and enjoy it for the cutesy mogwai or little creatures, things like that, in the comedy. But it will also kind of be kind of a pathway into enjoying like other horror movies, getting into horror. Like this one, Paranorman is one like that for me. I could see even Monster Squad being something like that. Like, hey, I want to watch other movies about Frankenstein and Dracula and Wolfman and things like that. So I love this as a gateway horror. I do want to give a shout out to 2 more of the supporting actors that you just didn't mention because you had so many others you wanted to mention. Dick Miller, great character actor. He plays Mr. Futterman, the next door neighbor. He's been in a ton of movies. I loved him in this movie. He's the one who's talking about. Basically is the one who gave him the name Gremlins. He's talking about the Gremlins that got into his tractor and ruined all damn foreign parts and things like that. And then Key Luke, who plays the old man who sells him the Mogwai. He's another guy who's small parts in a lot of good movies. He's great in this movie. But yeah, I agree. It's a great movie. It's produced by Spielberg. You can kind of tell it has that kind of Spielberg tone to it. Directed by I believe it's Joe Dante. Great choice. So that was my number 4.
Yes, Joe Dante did, and Chris Columbus wrote it.
Yeah, so let me go ahead and give my number 5 then, since I skipped that one. My number 5, trying to remember what I put down for number 5. Oh, another Stephen King movie. This is one I almost put it in underrated, but I decided make it my top 5 because honestly, the 80s were a little slim pickings for me for a top 5 because it's like there's a lot of movies that I enjoyed, but to call anything my favorites was kind of hard to do. So this one just made it in the cut at number 5, and that's Stephen King's Pet Sematary. Is little Gage's acting a little childish? I mean, he's a kid. What do you want? I want to play with you. That stuff. Which when you have a kid, do like me and make your kids start walking around to people saying that. It's hilarious the reactions they get. But this I thought was a well done horror movie. The remake was not good at all. The sequel, Chapter 2, starring Edward Furlong, that was not good at all. But I thought this one was effective horror, and I thought it's one of the movies that kind of actually caught kind of that Stephen King vibe to it very well. So that's my number 5.
I remember the first time I watched this. It was actually I was in a limo watching this on the little TV. Ryan, his mom, was getting married. and he didn't want to be around there. He didn't want to be in there. So we just went and we stuck into the limo, and we were just hanging out in there, and we had the TV on, and this was just on TV. And we were watching Pet Sematary. It's like, did we not watch Pet Sematary when we were doing our summer of horror? He was like, I don't remember. Because at that point, his brain was elsewhere. And so for me, it felt like I was watching it for the first time again. And I just remember like sitting there watching the scene where I think the sister's talking to her sister, and she's on the bed, and she, that iconic scene where people get creeped out by the sister because she was all like fucked up and shit. Was it her sister? It was her sister, right?
It's the mom is talking to her sister,
yeah. But yeah, I just remember watching that scene going, I thought this was about a killer cat. I was like, I don't remember this movie at all. I thought it was about a killer cat like Cujo. I was like, oh no, this is not really about that. But yeah, that's a memory burned in my brain. It's the first time watching that movie. I was sitting in a limo with my buddy who was literally, trying not to get him to not drink the champagne in the limo because of what was going on.
It's also one of those movies that, like, Final Destination 2, everybody knows. There's 3. 2, everybody knows for the, if you're driving down the street and you see a log truck, everybody knows you're going to die. Everyone has an instant connection. This movie for me, especially once I became parents, that same thing of like anytime my kids crossing the street, I'm just expecting some truck to come nailing down.
It's hard to watch it now and not laugh when that scene happens. My number 4, I mentioned earlier when we were talking about my introduction to horror, and that's Poltergeist. It's iconic in my brain because it's the first legit horror film that I ever laid eyes on. There's so many just iconic moments from that film. From, like I said, the tree reaching into a kid's room and pulling him out and trying to eat him, to the wooden clown doll wrapping its arms around him and trying to choke him out, to the skeletons in the ground coming up and trying to choke out the mom, to this house is clear. There's so many just moments in this, and most people now think of Poltergeist and they think about the urban legend stuff around the making of it with the other films, but this movie is like the perfect haunted house film. It's done so incredibly well. Also led by Craig T. Nelson, who I love as an actor. The rest of the cast is all solid with him as well. But this was just one of those movies that, like, the moments that happen in this film were just burrowed into my brain as a kid, hiding behind the couch as my brothers watched this movie. And it will forever just be one of those films that just stand out to me. Now, there might be movies that I love more than this, but this is a special film for me because it opened that door. And that's why it's in my number 4.
All right, my number 3 is another Wes Craven film, and it's kind of the most famous one. Is the original Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984.
That's also my number 3.
Well, there you go. I think this is the original. I think is probably still the best. I mean, I love New Nightmare, what they did with it, kind of the meta take on it. But as far as the straight Nightmare films, Elm Street films, I think the first one is by far the best. Because Freddy at this time, he was, this really fear-inducing character. He didn't become the kind of the one-liners and the comedy side they leaned into, especially from like 4 on. But he is still just a creative character. It was something original. Just the look they came up with the burned face and the knives and the gloves and all that kind of stuff. It's all iconic now, but at the time it was something new. It was exciting. I think that the cast does a great job across the board, especially Heather Langenkamp, who obviously this is her first time in that role as Nancy. And it was just, this is probably the first Wes Craven film I ever saw. Obviously, it's the first Nightmare I saw because I did manage to watch them in order. I think by the time I started watching these, I think I had heard of them. I was aware of them, but a little too young to watch them at the time. I think 3 was just hitting theaters when I started watching. I started with 1 and 2. And it's a classic for a reason. I can understand how it came to spawn a whole franchise. And while it did kind of gradually become a kind of self-parody of itself, as it kind of changed tone and things like that, this is still by far the scariest, and I think still the best well made too.
Yeah, I mean, it's not my favorite one that still goes to Freddy vs. Jason because I just love everything that they do with Freddy vs. Jason. I know it's not good, but I love that one. But yeah, I agree. This and New Nightmare are definitely the best, well-made, put together Freddy films. And yeah, I remember this was one of those that like I always caught like glimpses of it, and it was always the end. I don't know how many times I saw the damn mom going through the door window before I actually saw the whole film. And then, you know, obviously we all saw the Johnny Depp death, you know, ad nauseum. But I ever actually watched the whole thing through, probably until my summer of horror. And yeah, Freddy is an icon for a reason. Robert Englund puts on a phenomenal performance as Freddy, but this one, it's more, like I said, the horror driven and less of the comedic driven, which, I mean, depending on who you are, you either like the more comedy aspects of it or you like, you know, more of this version. I'm kind of in the middle. It depends on the film around him on whether he's.
It really does, because I enjoyed, because like I said, once they started I got older, after I caught up, I kind of started watching all these movies in theaters, and I enjoyed the one-liners and the kind of, you know, the creative, almost comedic kills in many aspects. But while I enjoy that side, but I also enjoy this, which makes me think like this one more when it's more serious.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, Nightmare is iconic for a reason, and I can't really see anyone who is a fan of horror who would just outright hate this movie. It's that iconic. There are reasons to not like, you know, the first Halloween film, and there's reasons to not like the first Friday the 13th. But I can't think of a single reason why you wouldn't like A Nightmare on Elm Street. It's literally the epitome of 80s, you know, slasher horror, you know, creature monster. It literally hits every spectrum. It's slasher to a point because he's literally slashing with knives. It's monster because he's a fucking like demon, and just the horror aesthetics of it. Like, it just the brilliant mind. Like, I love watching the making of for these. I love watching how they did, like I said, Johnny Depp's death, and how they did I'm blanking on the character names, but like the prison death scene, the original bedroom scene. Yeah. Even Nancy trying to run up the stairs, and it's like fucking marshmallows and stuff. Like, they just did such a beautiful job of making this thing work the way it did. And that, yeah, I was like, I kind of almost wanted it higher, but I was like, no, it's like, I love the other two movies so much more, but this is iconic and it needs to be on the list. My number two, because those are both our number threes. My number two, I know you love. So if you put it on this list, then we saw the same mindset. But I can easily see that you not put this on the list because you don't consider it horror, and that's Little Shop of Horrors.
Number two.
Okay, number two. So we're staying on that.
I swear, in future decades we're going to divert a little more. So yeah.
Yeah. Little Shop of Horrors. I know most people think of this movie. It's like, this is not a horror movie. This is a musical.
It's in the title, damn it.
It's literally in the fucking title. And then depending on if you ever get to see the uncut ending, that is a horror movie. The way it ends. I went back and rewatched this. It was either last year or the year prior. This movie's still so fucking good. It's so good. This was another one of those movies that young Sean was able to watch because parents didn't consider this a horror movie. They considered it a musical, and it was always on TV. And more times than not, the one scene I think I remember the most was either, oh God, I'm blanking on her name. Audrey, singing that song, and she's like dreaming about them in the white picket fence house. Or it's Steve Martin doing the dentist song. Those are like the two things I remember the most from as a kid. But yeah, Rick Moranis is great. Steve Martin's great. Everyone's great. The puppeteering for Audrey too. Just the whole cast, the music is phenomenal in this. Visually, everything looks great. There's literally not a single thing to hate about this movie, unless you're just not a fan of musicals, which I can respect that. But if you are a fan of musicals, there's not a single thing to not love about this film.
Yeah, I love Little Shop of Horrors. Little Shop of Horrors is a movie that was written. Well, it was a movie, a Roger Corman like low budget schlocky movie back in, I want to say the 70s, I guess. I think the most notable for Jack Nicholson, I think, played the dental patient in that version of it. Just a straight, you know, it was I believe it was a comedy, but it wasn't a musical. Alan Menken and Howard Ashman turned it into a Broadway musical, and then became a movie musical. Um, and they're the people who went on to do the music for all the best Disney movies, The Little Mermaids, your Aladdins, your Beauty and the Beast, all that kind of stuff. They did that whole run, and Alan Menken kept going after Howard Ashman died as well. So the music, the songs in this are spectacular by them. The cast across the board is great. I mean, obviously, you have the main stars, and just this one scene cameos by people like John Candy and Steve Martin. You know,
Bill
Jim
Murray.
Belushi and what's that? Bill Murray,
Bill
of course.
Murray.
Yeah, these people show up for one scene, knock it out of the park, and then move on, and you're done with them. Rick Moranis, who I love, we all miss him. Wish he didn't retire from acting, but while he was acting, he great stuff with this and Ghostbusters and Strange Brew and so many other things that I really love. So I love seeing him. Ellen Green, who plays Audrey, she played her in the original Broadway show, and then of course brought her on the movie. She's spectacular, so perfect for that role. But yeah, top to bottom, I love this movie. Is it straight horror? No, it's not. But that's this thing that's, as you'll see as we get on into more decades, horror is made up of so many subgenres, from horror comedies, musical horror, sci-fi horror. There's all kinds of different kinds of horror. And this one is a musical, it is a comedy, but it still qualifies as horror. Easily my number 2.
I feel like we're gonna have the same number 1. If not, then I'm so intrigued in what your number 1 is.
Yeah, it's the same for sure.
Okay. I will find it very shocking if we have the same top 3 the rest of the decades.
I don't think we will.
Yeah, I don't think we will either. So I guess our number 1 is Aliens.
Yes, it is.
Yes. I mean, when you... Yeah, and before you guys go, Aliens is a sci-fi film. Okay, yes, it is a sci-fi film, but it is also a fucking horror film. It literally is. You have chest bursters. You've got the oh my god, I said web crawlers. That's not right.
Face huggers.
Face huggers. Thank you. You have the Queen. You have so many just brutal deaths in this film. Like, if you guys think The Thing is a horror film, then so the fuck is Aliens. This was Aliens at its peak. This was. Some people will say the first one's the best one. Are you one of those? Or are you Aliens over Aliens?
I'm Aliens all the way.
Okay, same. You got more xenomorphs. You've got Sigourney Weaver just killing her role. You got Bill Paxton. Game over, man.
Bill Paxton, Jeanette Goldstein, and Lance Hendrickson. We were just talking about them.
Yes, you got Michael Biehn, who's always been the great number 2 person in most movies, especially in the 80s, with this and Terminator. You got, oh god, what's her name? Queen Badass, outside of Sigourney Weaver. Oh god, I'm blanking on her name. Vasquez.
Yes, Jeanette Goldstein.
Vasquez. Yes. Paul Reiser also in this. It's such a great cast.
Yeah.
It's such a great cast. Everything about this movie works. Aliens has always looked fantastic. Some people say it's too dark, but it's that's the whole fucking point, is that you can't see the xenomorphs coming. To the point where we were a little disappointed when Alien Romulus came out this year and was taking a little too much from Aliens, which doesn't work because Alien Romulus takes place before Aliens does. So, yeah, that didn't flow well. But Aliens was one of the best films in the 1980s, hands down. And that's not even counting it as a horror film. It's just one of the best films, period, there. This movie is iconic, much like the films we've already been talking about on this list. There's not anything you can really find wrong with this film. It is perfection in terms of what it was set out to do.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot more to add to that. This is a perfect sci-fi horror film. Performances great across the board, including Sigourney Weaver, who was nominated for an Academy Award for this role, by the way, which you don't see a lot of times in sci-fi or horror, much less a sci-fi horror. James Cameron, after Terminator, he kind of cemented himself as this dude is the one to watch. Unfortunately, only made a couple more films before he just did nothing but avatars for 3 decades. But that's discussion for another day. I just think it's great made. It always has had this reputation of being too dark and being grainy and things like that, which it's kind of intentional. It was the film.
It is totally intentional.
Although I will say they just came out with a 4K Blu-ray disc of it. And a new 4K master that you can get on digital streaming services as well, and it looks beautiful. It looks so beautiful. it looks like almost like it's a brand new movie. So, but yeah, this is pretty much a perfect movie, top to bottom. I have not much more to add to what you just said. So, number one.
Yes, and that's 80s. That's 80s horror for us. Anything you'd like to add before we head out?
No, I mean that's about it. I will say that as you'll see, as far as the '80s is concerned, um, towards the end of the '80s, these slasher films were getting a little bit tired, things like that, and things like kind of landscape of horror was changing. As we'll get into the '90s, you'll see that horror was kind of dying and got rejuvenated in the mid '90s, but that's for the next episode.
Yes. So, what were your guys' thoughts? What are your favorite horror films of the 1980s? What are the ones that you think are overrated or underrated? Let us know in the comments below. And we hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you guys did, go and hit that like, share, and subscribe button to the channel so you guys stay up to date with all the latest videos that pop up on the Movie Crusaders. And of course, you can follow us on all the social media outlets you see below. Coming up next, well, we're going to be back for the 90s of horror. Talking about basically the same stuff we did here, but with 90s spin on it. And that'll be a whole other kind of interesting conversation, much like Brian said. So we'll be doing that. This is coming out. I don't know when we're going to drop this. We might drop this. I can drop this at any point because it is October now. Joker 2. I'm just going to call it Joker 2. That comes out this weekend. Not sure when we're going to get a review of it because personal life things are going crazy for me right now, so I don't know if I'm gonna get to see it in theaters when I want. So there will be a review out at some point for it, or we might just wait for Movie Crusaders chat about and talk about it then. Next week though, we got Terrifier 3 and we got Saturday Night. Two movies that have been on Brian and I's most anticipated for the fall, so we will definitely be talking about those two films on their own separate episodes. And like I said, stick with us now every week up through Halloween. We're going to go through each decade. And next one, like I said, is going to be the 90s. And yeah, we hope you guys stick around and follow us through this journey of horror with us. But until next time, we are the Movie Crusaders. And in case we don't see you, go watch the movies. Go have some fun.
You're still here. It's over. Go home.